Hello and welcome to your lecture on values in games, where I'm excited because we're going to get to talk about my favourite World of Warcraft player of all time, Everbloom. What do you mean you don't have a favourite World of Warcraft player? Never mind, you'll love Everbloom after I tell you about them. So how's this topic different? So we've previously been talking about procedural rhetoric, which is a really great framework for thinking about how values and messages can be conveyed through the procedures and systems of a game, which is one of those elements of a game that makes it so unique in comparison to film and literature. Values in games is another framework for thinking about how games can be persuasive and how we can do things with games. It's a tool set for explaining how your game's design concept is persuasive that encompasses more than just its procedures and systems. It also encompasses aesthetics, controls, mechanics, story, and other game elements like that. So to kind of engage you with what this framework is able to do, let's think about these two kind of thought experiments. The first one is about Everbloom. Everbloom is a World of Warcraft player who reaches the maximum level without completing any quests or killing any enemies. The only quest that they did complete was by accident when they opened a piece of in-game mail. They get to this maximum level by exploring new areas, which grants you a small amount of experience points, and by collecting flowers and making potions. We know that this is the wrong way to play World of Warcraft, but how is it that we know this? How is it that the game steers us towards a particular interpretation of how we should be playing the game? The second thought is about Grand Theft Auto. How is it that we know that... Grand Theft Auto receives a lot of media panic attention in the way that it supposedly encourages violence. Is it fair to say that Grand Theft Auto is an inherently violent virtual world? How might we justify such a claim? Every game expresses a set of values, but it's often very difficult to understand the many ways in which these values come to be embodied in a game. Flanagan and Nissenbaum break this down and give us a framework for understanding this with two broad categories: designer understandings and player perceptions. Understanding these can be useful for identifying how values are subconsciously or consciously, in the case of your serious games concept, built into a game. So firstly, we've got designer understandings, which encompasses what gets embodied in a game during its design. The company or an organization that's building a game faces economic and commercial constraints. For instance, they might know that the way that they're going to make money off this game is through monetization, so they'll emphasize the avatar so that you care more about your avatar's aesthetic experience and are more likely to purchase upgrades to how your avatar looks. There's public policy and industry regulation that constrains games. We might want a game to be PG-13, which is going to mean we're not going to include drugs or too much gore. Or we might want to release our game in Germany, which means we won't be able to include swastikas in it, because in German law, games are not allowed to include swastikas because they are seen as inherently trivializing in a way that literature and film are not, a topic that we'll be talking about later in the semester. But game designers are also operating and producing games for a particular culture. And those understandings and perceptions that we have about that imagined audience shape the decisions that we make when we're designing any type of artifact. The tools that we use to create games also shape the way that games are made. Unity is a very popular games design game development engine, valued at over $3 billion for the breadth of games that utilize it as an engine to build a game. This games engine was basically built because the initial developers made a first-person shooter game. It wasn't very good, but they realized that the game's engine that they had made was pretty good, so they made that available for other people to use. This means that the game is kind of really good for first-person shooter type things, but not so great for other types of games. I've got a colleague who was developing a game and he wanted to have a torchlight in it. And the only way that he was able to make a torchlight work was by copying the code of a shotgun, as though you are spraying the light and shooting things with the light to make them react to the light differently. So, and further other designer understandings come from the designers themselves, so their pre-existing commitments, their skills, and the assumptions that they're making about the values and the abilities of their target audiences. A game that we design for people who don't play games is going to look very differently and have very different mechanics to a game that we design for people who play games 40 hours a week. Flanagan and Nissenbaum contrast this to the player perceptions, which is the way that the people playing a game may not have identical values or experiences with a game because of their personal, cultural, social, and societal factors that influence your experience of the values in a game each time you play the same game. Their core argument is that the game mechanics and narrative elements of a game create constraints which preclude some interpretations and steer you towards others, but we can't guarantee that someone is going to have the same experience from a game because of the way that personal, cultural, and historical factors might change the way that we experience something. A great example of this is rugby, a really popular sport in New South Wales. I'm not from New South Wales. It wasn't something that I played growing up. And for some, rugby, people who grew up playing rugby, it was a core part of their kind of family life, going to see rugby games. It's a game about cooperation, teamwork, and collegiality. But for others, we might view rugby as a game which promotes values of violence, antagonism, misogyny, and territoriality. It shows us how our history with games, and games as artifacts of culture, can change our experience with them. Another really good example of this at work comes from a colleague of mine from Melbourne, Creatrix Tiara, who's an interactive artist, who spoke about the game their experience playing the game Papers, Please. Now you might remember Papers, Please as one of the required gamings from last week, where you play as an immigration agent, assessing the applications from people trying to get through a Eastern European bloc-style border wall, separating families and things like that. And you are kind of pressed to enforce these rules that you know through various narrative elements and others to be wrong. So Creatrix, as an immigrant to Australia, spoke about how they hated Papers, Please. Couldn't barely get through the first two playthroughs, nearly wanted to throw their computer at the wall. Not because there was anything wrong with the game, very cleverly done, but because Creatrix has been at the mercy of immigration systems their entire life. And they resented the game's attempt to make you sympathise with the immigration agent. In this game, you're a cog in the system. But even in Creatrix's experiences, even these cogs are happily complicit. They're not just following orders to feed their family as you are in Papers, Please. They often deeply believe in the same xenophobic, Kafkaesque principles that they are tasked to enforce. We might think of other examples, like the experience of that dragon cancer for someone who has been through having a family member with terminal illness or not, or how our attitudes towards a game like Secret Hitler might change how we experience it based on our personal histories with World War II and the Holocaust. To think about a game that maybe then does this really well, we can look at a game like Flower. Flower is a game from 2003 that allows players to control the wind, with a single flower petal marking their movement. You work to help the flowers bloom, gather petals, activate wind farms, and spread life. The interaction in Flower between player and game is one of minimal intrusion. Players gently guide the game world, and this interaction is very consistent is a consistent translation of the game's values, which focus on encouraging players to work in partnership with the environment towards the game's overall ecological message. So we see how the mechanics of the game, combined with the aesthetic elements and what was possible to do, express these values in a coherent way of sustainability, cooperation, and gentle influence. Another great example of this for me is Journey, a game where you are in kind of solving desert puzzles, and people who have previously completed those puzzles can come and help you along in the game. Having someone follow you along and help guide you through this game, they can't interact with you, they can't speak to you, they can just kind of have their avatar near you and lead you in the right direction. It is really kind of poignant, beautiful, cooperative, but they actually had to remove the ability for avatars to collide with each other because people were using that mechanic to push people off ledges and things like that. By not allowing negative interactions between players, the cooperative value of the game is kind of maintained. Another example that I think helps us understand the way that player perceptions can influence the way that we experience a game, and how game mechanics can only shape interpretations and preclude some interpretations, can be seen in war games like the Call of Duty series. So the first 3 Call of Duty games are played from the perspective of Allied soldiers in World War II. The story modes, they convey a reverence for heroism and sacrifice. You are a player who is in the D-Day landings in Normandy, for example. So some people argue that the reverential depiction of Allied forces in World War II promotes a pro-military consensus, Call of Duty having a patriotic and militaristic values, and it's in this way that the games are quite political. What's really interesting though is a study in 2010 found that American players who identified as politically conservative interpreted the games as an affirmation of a strong defense policy and support for an aggressive foreign policy, as well as a high regard for the military. This is a war in which a moral war where US intervention was necessary, supporting that more broadly. On the other hand, players who were left-wing or not American saw the games as a contrast between good wars and bad wars in the context of the moral clarity of World War II, Nazis, obviously bad guys, versus the Iraq War that was kind of going on at the time of this data collection. So it really goes to show how the lessons that we learn from a game and the experiences that we have are shaped by our own attitudes and experiences and politics. And thinking through how it is that you can shape the player's interpretations in a particular way using mechanics, using different mechanics and game elements, is the strength of this framework. As a bit of a side note, World War I is a game which is a relatively rare setting for video games because it lacks this clear good-evil narrative of World War II, which is really kind of crucial for kind of a lot of the player experiences that we have in World War II games. In World War I, most all soldiers on both sides are viewed as victims of an uncaring and incompetent upper class, and our kind of imaginations of the game are based in kind of the misery of trench warfare as opposed to the heroism and valor of individual battles across a continent. Battlefield 1 approaches this by having individual acts of heroism and valor. So there's not one big storyline, but you're kind of a good someone trying to do the right thing over here, someone trying to do the right thing over there, and so on. As opposed to these grand narratives of war victory in other Call of Duty games and other Battlefield games where you, a single soldier, defeat Hitler. So we can now return to this thought about Everbloom, our favourite World of Warcraft player, who gets to the maximum level without ever killing an enemy or without completing a quest. So we can interpret the designer understandings of World of Warcraft to help us understand, which provides contexts by which we understand the values of World of Warcraft and why playing this game peacefully is the wrong way to play, right? This is a game in an established genre, MMORPGs. There's a narrative in the game between the relationships between the player character and the non-player characters that playing, it's the end of the world, guys, and you're just out there collecting flowers. There are easier ways to get levels and experience points. Giving people options, but some are really difficult and some are really easy, shapes the way that we behave. But there are also affordances that we have with the game world. We can't hug enemy monsters. We can only have these violent interactions with them, and therefore playing it peacefully is the wrong way to play. Like, there are a lot of values that this game has in its mechanics and values that it doesn't have. But we can also look at the player perceptions of World of Warcraft, why someone might want to play, to know that Everbloom is playing this game wrong. The social experiences in the game, which is a key part of its appeal and popularity, are organised around killing and quests. Within the context of hardcore, serious gaming, like World of Warcraft is a pretty serious hardcore game, with rationalisation, theory crafting, and efficiencies being one of the core goals, playing this game in such an inefficient way is wrong. And also, just to consume the bulk of the game, to ignore the bulk of the game content, is to just not get your money's worth. And it's through these ways that we understand that we are pushed away from this kind of interpretation of the game, knowing that it's wrong. So this is the strength of the language of values. The many interrelated elements of a game, its narrative, its interface, interactions, and mechanics contribute to a coherent play experience. Any of these elements can have cultural, ethical, and political significance even when they appear value neutral. The required reading for this week, by Bellman, unpacks 15 elements in which values can be conveyed in games with numerous examples. These elements are really useful for talking about how you have consciously embedded values in the decisions that you've made in your serious game design concept. You want to avoid dissonance. You don't want to have a game about climate change in which you can kind of do a lot of things that are bad for the environment. So we'll go through some of the examples to help you understand this when you attempt this reading. For example, choice. Unlike most other media, games can provide players an opportunity for choice, and it's therefore a very popular mechanic in designing a serious games concept. In some cases, these choices can have moral valence. In the McDonald's video game, you are afforded the choice of making immoral decisions, allowing you to explore and understand immoral business practices. And we know that it is immoral to feed people sick cows before we go into the game, and so we kind of understand the moral valence of that. Other times the game might have to tell us what that moral valence is. But even in something like the McDonald's video game, is it just an illusion of choice? You kind of either fail at being the McDonald's CEO or you make the choice to do these unethical things. So the game can really push you towards a particular interpretation. And that kind of clarity about how these mechanics work is what makes a really good games pitch. We can look at the rules for interaction with the environment, right? Looking at a game like StarCraft, which models a purpose for the world's finite resources by limiting the types of interactions that you can have with the game world to being harvesting the world's raw materials to build military objects, right? They model a purpose for the world's resources by only having certain types of interactions available between the player and the game world. And so this helps us reassess thought number 2. Is Grand Theft Auto an inherently violent game? The limited interactions that a player character can have with the game steers players towards an interpretation of the GTA's game world as violent, subsequently encouraging further violent interactions with the game world. Just like how I can't hug the monsters in World of Warcraft, you can't hug other non-player characters. The only buttons I have on my controller to interact with them are to shoot them or punch them in the face, right? In this way, we see how game mechanics and narrative elements create constraints that preclude some interpretations and steer players towards others. Another great example of this at work is Brenda Romero's Train. In this game, you're tasked with taking these trains through a number of different train stations and moving these yellow tokens as efficiently as possible to their end destination. Players get very enthusiastic into working out the most efficient way to do this task. But partway through the game, players discover that the destinations are concentration camps, and the tokens represent Jews. The last page of the rules is even scrolled onto a vintage Nazi typewriter. The result is the player is complicit in an abhorrent action that they might have otherwise resisted or tried to avoid if they had known. In this way, games can get us inside of topics. They can make us complicit. Games they aren't necessarily here to capture the difficult emotions the way music and films do, not in a cutscene, but can they do it in the mechanics themselves? Brenda Romero asks with this example. And this I want to encourage you to think about. I use this example to encourage you to think about the serious, persuasive and educational potential of games that goes beyond just learning facts like, oh, if you put a park in a neighborhood, the house prices will go up because it will be a nicer place to live. But can we get someone inside the experience, the emotional experience of what gentrification must be like on a community where there are people who are winning out of that, people who are losing, and how heritage and history can be destroyed in a way that's very difficult to resist? Can we use a game to get you inside that, have that emotional experience that is otherwise very difficult for you to access? So to begin to wrap up, Bellman's reading talks about a lot of games design, elements of a game's design, but there are many that aren't mentioned in the Bellman chapter, and you might want to reflect on the games that you've experienced and what kinds of game mechanics led to those experiences, right? But mechanics that, like revealing information, can make, as it was the example in Train, can make players reflect on the actions and exploit the way that we typically play games. I didn't know that was going on because I knew you were going to play that way. We were able to kind of reveal information later that changes your interpretation of an experience you've already had. We can look at other mechanics like Survivor's Simultaneous Vote, which introduces secrecy, betrayal, and trust into the game, or permadeath in a game like DayZ, When you die in DayZ, you lose everything. You go back to the beginning with no guns, weapons, armor. And so the whole experience of DayZ is transformed by this one game mechanic, because you're no longer running into the firefight like you do in Call of Duty, where death is just a minor experience, returning to the game only a few seconds later. But it is this, but all combat is highly valence, because you really don't want to die, and you're cautious and cerebral throughout your entire playthrough. Think about how other social mechanics can implement the values in the game that you're designing. Most people tend to design a single-player game for the serious games design concept, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to do really cool things in a multiplayer game. Is it competitive with player killing and betrayal, or is it cooperative with things like role-playing teams and multiple winners, changing the way that people might interact, behave, and experience? What types of interactions are you going to offer between players? Are you only going to allow them to kill each other, or are you going to allow them to trade and negotiate? How might I positively interact with another player as opposed to negatively? And how might that be taken up in the design of your serious game? So if you're designing around empathy, make sure to check out this reading by Bellman that utilizes this framework. And for a great description about how to go about doing design with values, this is a really useful reading and guide. This framework is really helpful for thinking about how mechanics and other game elements other than its procedures and systems can convey messages and used for a serious purpose. So make sure to check out the full website of the Values at Play project above. And that brings us to the end of the Values in Games lecture. I'm really glad that you now have a favorite World of Warcraft player, Everbloom, and I look forward to seeing you next week. See you later.